Since the dawn of human thought, our deepest questions have revolved around two mysteries that elude any final answer. The first is perhaps the most fundamental question of all. Why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is reality even there at all? Yet standing right beside it is a second, no less enigmatic mystery. Why is there consciousness? Why do beings exist that not only traverse this universe but perceive, experience, and witness it? Why is there an inner experience, thoughts, feelings, meaning? For a long time, these two questions have been treated separately. One has been left to physics, the other to psychology or philosophy. But what if this separation itself is the error? What if the universe not only exists, but exists to be perceived? What if consciousness is not merely a byproduct of matter, but the key through which reality gains any meaning at all? For without perception, there would be no values, no beauty, no sense, no question of existence. Perhaps the greatest mystery of reality is not what exists, but that it is experienced. And perhaps the understanding of existence begins precisely where matter ends and consciousness begins. Why is there something and not nothing? This question appears simple at first glance, almost childlike. Yet it is the deepest question the human mind can pose. It lies beneath every scientific theory, beneath every religious notion, beneath every philosophical speculation. For before we can ask how the universe works, we must ask why it exists at all. For centuries, people have tried to answer this question. Myths spoke of gods who created the world. Religions spoke of a creator's will. Modern science, in turn, tells the story of the Big Bang, an explosive beginning from which space, time, matter, and energy are said to have emerged. Yet even this explanation hits a wall. The Big Bang describes how the universe has evolved from the very first moment of time. But it does not explain why there was even that moment to begin with. For with the Big Bang, not only did the universe begin, but time itself began as well. And here lies a logical problem. If time only begins with the universe, then the question, what was before, makes no sense. Stephen Hawking emphasized this when he stated that the question of before is as meaningless as asking about the point north of the North Pole. Time itself only emerges with the cosmos. Yet for many, this answer feels unsatisfactory. For even if we accept that there was no before, the question remains, why does a universe with time, space, and laws of nature exist at all? Why is there a beginning rather than nothing? Physicists have tried to bridge this gap. Some theories speak of quantum fluctuations from which a universe can spontaneously arise. In this model, nothing is not an absolute void, but a quantum vacuum where particles emerge and vanish. Yet here too, the problem merely shifts. For why is there even a quantum vacuum? Why do the laws of quantum mechanics apply there? Why do these structures exist and not others? Every explanation presupposes something, and therein lies the central dilemma of the question of existence. As soon as we name an origin, the next question immediately arises about its origin. Every cause demands another cause. And this infinite referencing back is known in philosophy as an infinite regress. Instead of explaining existence, we accumulate ever more things that themselves require explanation. Cause alone cannot explain existence, for cause already presupposes existence. The question of the origin of the universe is therefore not only a physical question, but a metaphysical one. It does not concern individual events within the world, but the existence of the world as a whole. Here begins a realization that many thinkers share, regardless of culture or epoch. Perhaps existence cannot be explained by something that itself requires explanation. Perhaps existence needs a different kind of explanation. Instead of searching for a first cause, philosophers began to ask whether there might be something that explains itself, something whose existence does not depend on something else, something for which the question, why does it exist, demands no further answer. Such a reason must be self-justifying. It must not be contingent. It must exist from itself. But what could such a thing be? Matter is ruled out. Natural laws are ruled out, for both could be different or might not exist at all. It is precisely here that a realm of thought opens up, which modern natural science has long avoided, yet is increasingly being taken seriously again. The possibility that existence does not primarily arise from matter, but from something deeper. For the greatest problem of all physical explanations is not their complexity, but their dependency. They describe processes within existence, not the reason why existence exists. The question, why is there something, cannot be answered by merely listing new things that exist. It demands a principle where explanation and existence coincide, and it is precisely here that the connection to a second, equally enigmatic phenomenon begins: consciousness. Consciousness is the only thing we know that cannot obviously be traced back to something else. Every thought, every perception, every experience is given immediately. Consciousness is not observable from the outside, but can only be experienced from within. And yet it is the most certain thing we know. While everything else can theoretically be questioned, one thing remains unshakable: that something is being experienced. This fact alone is remarkable, for it means that existence not only takes place but appears. Perhaps this is no coincidence. Perhaps existence is not simply a blind state, but something that is connected to experience. Perhaps the reason why there is something at all cannot be found in a mechanical cause, but in a form of inner necessity. At this point, cosmology and philosophy touch. The question of the origin of the universe becomes a question about the nature of reality itself. No longer what caused it, but rather, what must reality be for it to exist at all? When cause fails, when time allows no before point, when every physical explanation presupposes something, then the possibility remains that existence did not emerge, but has always been fundamentally so in a certain way, not in a temporal sense, but in an ontological one. Perhaps existence is not the result of something. Perhaps it is the starting point, and perhaps the understanding of this question does not begin with stars, particles, or formulas, but at the only place where existence reveals itself directly, in conscious experience itself. Thus, this chapter does not end with an answer, but with a shift in perspective. The question is no longer merely, why is there a universe? But rather, what kind of reality must it be for existence to be even possible? And it is precisely here that the next riddle begins. Consciousness is the most certain thing we know, and at the same time the least explained. Everything we know about the world, we know through consciousness. Every thought, every measurement, every theory, every observation presupposes that something is being experienced. And yet this very foundation of our knowledge remains a mystery. We can measure galaxies, accelerate particles, map brain areas, but why it feels like something to be a human being eludes any definitive explanation to this day. Modern science has achieved tremendous success by reducing the world to measurable structures. It describes forces, fields, processes, interactions, yet it describes them from the outside. It explains what happens, not how it feels. And this is precisely where the problem begins. For consciousness is not an object among objects. It is not a thing in space. It is not a measurable component of the world, but the very space in which the world appears. When we attempt to treat consciousness as a physical phenomenon, we lose exactly what it is, the experience itself. Materialism, the assumption that everything that exists can ultimately be traced back to matter and its interactions, hits a limit here. It can explain how the brain processes information. It can show which neural patterns correlate with perception, memory, or emotion. But it cannot explain why these processes are accompanied by inner experience. Why is there even an inner life? Why is perception not merely blind information processing? Why are there colors, sounds, feelings, meaning? Why is there a how it is, a subjective experience, a first-person living? These questions cannot be answered by more data, for it is not a gap in knowledge that we face, but a gap in the explanatory framework. Science describes behavior and structure. Consciousness, however, is experience. The philosopher David Chalmers has termed this problem the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problem, as paradoxical as it sounds, consists of explaining how the brain processes stimuli, makes decisions, directs attention. All of this is complex but fundamentally accessible. The hard problem is something else. Why are all these processes accompanied by subjective experience? Why is there anything that experiences at all? Materialistic theories find themselves in a curious situation here. Either they explain consciousness away by claiming it is an illusion, which is paradoxical, for an illusion must be experienced, or they do not explain it away, but rather tacitly assume it without justification. For no neural model explains why electrical activity suddenly acquires meaning, why fluctuations in voltage feel like pain, why chemical processes give rise to joy or sorrow. The correlation is measurable. The explanation is absent. This is not a failure of individual researchers. It is an indication that consciousness may not exist on the same level as the phenomena we otherwise investigate. Science excels at describing the outer structure of reality, yet it says nothing about its inner nature. Physics explains how things behave. It does not explain what they are. We know how matter behaves, mathematically precise, but what matter is in itself remains open. Here, an unexpected thought unfolds. Perhaps consciousness is not something that adds to matter, but rather something that grants us access to its inner side. For consciousness is the only phenomenon where we not only know behavior, but also the inner perspective. We do not know what it is like to be an electron, but we know what it is like to be human. Consciousness is the only place where reality reveals itself from within. This raises a radical question. What if consciousness is not a late byproduct of an otherwise unconscious universe, but a fundamental aspect of reality? What if the materialistic description of the world captures only its outer shell, and consciousness allows us a glimpse into its depths? This idea is not new. It has been discussed in various forms across many philosophical traditions. What is new is that it is returning seriously to scientific debate, not out of esoteric impulse, but out of theoretical necessity. For the more precisely we examine the brain, the clearer it becomes. No matter how detailed a description of neural processes we provide, it does not explain the experience itself. The map is not the territory, and the description is not the experience. Science describes the world from a third-person perspective. Consciousness is the world from a first-person perspective. Both are viewpoints on the same reality, but they are not interchangeable. When we attempt to fully translate the first person into the third, we lose the essence. This does not mean that science is wrong. It means that it is incomplete when it comes to consciousness. And perhaps that is the crucial hint. Perhaps the unsolved riddle of consciousness does not indicate that we need to measure more, but that we need to think differently, that we must expand the framework within which we understand reality, not against science but beyond it, for consciousness is not some marginal phenomenon. It is the center of all meaning. Without consciousness, there would be no values, no truth, no sense. A universe without consciousness would be a universe where nothing matters, not even its own existence. And yet, consciousness exists, undeniably, immediately, in every waking moment. This makes it so disturbing and so fundamental. If the most certain thing we know is also the least explained, then it says something profound about our situation. Perhaps consciousness is not the problem that needs to be explained. Perhaps it is the key that shows our conception of reality is incomplete. Perhaps it is not consciousness that has entered into a material world. Perhaps matter is what consciousness observes from the outside. This possibility changes everything. It shifts the question from, how does consciousness arise, to, what kind of reality allows for consciousness? And it is precisely at this point that the riddle of consciousness begins to intertwine with the riddle of existence. For if consciousness is unexplainable because it is itself the framework of all explanation, then it may be that we do not encounter an end here, but a beginning. The idea that consciousness is more fundamental than matter initially seems strange to the modern mind. We are accustomed to viewing consciousness as a product of the brain, as something that arises when matter reaches a certain complexity. Yet this perspective is historically young, and it is by no means the only option. In fact, a very old idea is making its return here, an idea that was formulated long before modern physics, and which today is being taken seriously for entirely new reasons. That consciousness does not emerge from the world, but rather that the world appears within consciousness. This perspective was articulated with particular clarity in what is known as German idealism, a philosophical movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Thinkers like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel put forth a radical thesis. To understand why anything exists at all, we need not explain consciousness. We must begin with it. The starting point for these thinkers was a simple yet consequential observation. Everything we know is given to us in consciousness. Every perception, every idea, every scientific theory, every measurement, they all appear within a conscious experience. Consciousness is not something we discover in the world. It is the very space in which the world is discovered at all. If this is true, then it is logically questionable to treat consciousness as a late byproduct of the world, for in doing so one would attempt to explain something that is already presupposed in order to explain anything at all. Fichte articulated this thought particularly clearly. He argued that the conscious self cannot be reduced to something else. It is not grounded by external causes, it posits itself. Consciousness does not exist because something else exists, but by experiencing itself as conscious. In this sense, it is self-grounding. This is a crucial point, for it is precisely here that we encounter once again the problem of infinite regress, which we have already seen in the question of the origin of the universe. If everything must be explained by something else, explanation never ends. To truly explain existence, we need something that requires no further explanation. Schelling recognized that this very property is found in consciousness. Consciousness does not refer to something outside of itself in order to exist. It is immediately present. It exists in itself and for itself. This self-referentiality is not a flaw, but a sign of its unique status. Schelling extended this principle to existence itself. If there is to be a final reason for reality, then it must be self-existing. It cannot depend on something else. It must be the cause of itself, not temporally but structurally. And this very property, Schelling argued, can be found nowhere else but in consciousness. Hegel took it a step further. For him, reality was not a static thing but a process of self-recognition. The absolute, thus the reason for reality, is not a dead substance but a whole that comprehends itself. Existence, therefore, is not simply present. It understands itself through conscious beings. This may sound abstract, yet the core idea is astonishingly modern. Reality is not something that exists blindly. It is something that presents itself. For a long time, these thoughts were dismissed as speculative. Natural science seemed to succeed without them. Yet with the unresolved riddle of consciousness, they now return in a new form. Not as metaphysics born of ignorance, but as metaphysics born of theoretical necessity. For if consciousness cannot be explained by matter, then only one alternative remains. Matter must be explained by something that possesses conscious aspects, or at the very least, is not foreign to them. Modern philosophers have further developed this idea, cementing the thought that consciousness needs no external foundation, but rather sustains itself, emerges today in concepts such as self-referentiality, intentionality, and inner perspective. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. It is directed. It has meaning. And this meaning is not physically measurable but experienced. Matter, on the other hand, we only know through its behavior. We understand how it moves, how it interacts, how it can be described mathematically. Yet what it is in itself, we do not know. Physics describes relations, not the inner nature of things. Consciousness is precisely the opposite. We know its inner workings directly, but its outer structure only indirectly. What if these two perspectives are two sides of the same reality? What if matter is the outer appearance of what consciousness experiences internally? What if consciousness is not in the world, but the world is anchored in a conscious ground? This idea is not only being discussed philosophically today, but is also being cautiously considered by some natural scientists, not because it has been proven, but because it accomplishes something that materialism cannot. It explains why there is experience at all, without dismissing it. If consciousness is fundamental, then it is no longer a mystery why it exists. Then it is what exists, and matter is one of its expressions. In that case, consciousness is not the product of the universe, but the medium through which the universe gains reality. This does not mean that individual human consciousnesses are eternal or omnipotent. It does not mean that the brain is irrelevant. On the contrary, the brain would then be a channel, a form in which consciousness is localized and organized, not the origin, but the interface. Understood this way, consciousness needs no external foundation. It is not in need of explanation in the same sense as matter. It explains itself simply by being. This very property makes it a serious candidate for the ground of reality. This perspective demands a radical shift in our thinking. It urges us to reconsider the self-evident, not matter as the basis and consciousness as the exception, but consciousness as the basis and matter as appearance. Perhaps this is why consciousness so stubbornly eludes all reduction, not because we do not know enough yet, but because we are trying to explain something fundamental from something derived. If consciousness is indeed more fundamental than matter, then the entire question of existence changes. Reality is no longer primarily mechanical, but experiential. Not blind, but open to meaning. Not random, but internally structured. And then the existence of conscious beings is not a cosmic accident, but a necessary expression of what reality is at its core. Thus, a circle closes. The question of the origin of the universe and the question of the origin of consciousness are not two puzzles, but one single puzzle, and perhaps their solution begins precisely where we have stopped looking, within consciousness itself. With the advent of quantum physics, reality began to resist our intuitive notions. Where classical physics described an objective world that exists independently of the observer, something disturbing suddenly emerged. Observation itself seems to influence reality. At the center of this irritation lies a simple yet radical result. At the quantum level, a system does not possess a definitively determined state before measurement. Particles are not here or there, but in a superposition of multiple possibilities. Understand only through measurement, through observation, does the system assume a concrete state. Not before, only then. This raises a question that extends far beyond physics. What exactly does observation mean? In the classical world, observation is passive. It changes nothing. In the quantum world, it is active. It defines. It narrows down possibilities. Reality is not simply given, it is established. For a long time, people tried to alleviate this problem by technicizing the concept of observation. It was said that it is not consciousness that observes, but measuring devices. Yet this merely shifts the question. For measuring devices do not provide reality, they provide data. Meaning only arises when information becomes accessible, when it can, in principle, be grasped by a conscious system. It is precisely here that a crack opens in our worldview. If the state of a system depends on what information is available, then reality is not independent of knowledge. It is intertwined with it. The world does not simply present itself, it responds to questions. It becomes even more unsettling when one considers that in some quantum physical experiments, decisions made in the present seemingly determine what a particle did in the past. It is as if the future retroactively shapes history. Time loses its clear direction. Cause and effect become unstable. These effects are not philosophical games. They have been experimentally confirmed many times. The question is not whether they are real, but how we interpret them. One possible interpretation is this: the world does not exist fully determined and independent of observers. It exists as a field of possibilities that is concretized through acts of observation. Reality is not a static object, but a process. In this view, the universe becomes something fundamentally different from a machine. It transforms into a self-updating event, in which observation plays a constitutive role, not as a magical force but as a necessary condition for definiteness. This leads to a provocative question: what if the universe as a whole is an observing process? What if existence consists not only in something happening, but in it being experienced? Some physicists and philosophers have articulated exactly this thought. They propose that the universe, in a certain way, observes itself. That conscious beings are not random spectators, but necessary participants in a cosmic cycle, in which observation stabilizes reality. From this perspective, consciousness is not a later addition to the world, but an integral part of its functioning. The world needs observation to be established, and observation needs consciousness. This does not mean that individual human consciousness creates the universe. It means something subtler, that reality is, at a fundamental level, information dependent, and that information would be empty without principled accessibility. Observation here is not synonymous with human perception. It is a structural principle. Yet conscious beings are so far the only known carriers of this principle. This casts our role in the cosmos in a new light. We are not mere byproducts of indifferent matter. We are nodes where the world becomes concrete, places where possibilities become reality. In this view, time is also not a fixed bond, but a relational structure. The past, present, and future are not strictly separated, but interconnected through observation. Decisions and insights can retroactively generate meaning, not causally in the classical sense, but structurally. Existence thus becomes something dynamic, not fully determined but open, and not completed but in the process of becoming. The universe no longer appears as a stage on which we perform, but as a process in which we are involved, not as an audience but as a relationship. Are we then participants in existence? If observation shapes reality, then yes, at least in a limited but crucial sense. Not as creators out of nothing, but as contributors to the concretization of what is possible. This also changes the meaning of knowledge. Knowledge is no longer merely a representation of a finished world. It is part of its emergence. Every observation is a selection. Every selection excludes possibilities and makes others real. The world we experience is therefore not independent of us, but neither is it arbitrary. It emerges in the interplay of lawfulness and perception, of structure and meaning. Perhaps this is the deeper message of quantum physics, that reality does not exist fully without relationship, that being and knowing are inextricably intertwined. And perhaps this explains why consciousness cannot be explained by the world, not because it is too complex, but because it stands on the same level as it. If this is true, then the universe is not a silent mechanism. It is an open process that relies on observation. and we are not here by chance. We are part of the way existence happens at all. When we try to understand why anything exists at all, we repeatedly encounter the same boundary. Physical explanations tell us how things behave, but not why they exist. Laws describe processes, yet they do not justify existence. At this point, another dimension comes into view, one that has long been excluded from scientific discourse: meaning. Meaning is often regarded in modern thought as a byproduct, as something subjective, as a human projection onto an otherwise indifferent world. Values, purpose, meaning. All of this appears to many as psychological embellishment in a universe that is, in itself, empty and neutral. But what if this assumption is precisely wrong? What if meaning does not arise from existence, but existence arises from meaning? Consciousness is the place where meaning emerges. Without conscious experience, there is no value, no meaning, no relevance. A universe without consciousness would not be sad or empty. It would be meaningless. Nothing would count. Nothing would be anything. In this sense, meaning is not something additional, but that which makes reality significant at all. This insight leads to a radical reversal of our thinking. Perhaps the world does not exist by chance and only later acquires meaning. Perhaps it exists because it carries meaning. This idea has deep philosophical roots. Even in antiquity, it was suspected that existence does not arise from mere mechanics, but from an inner value. The notion that the good, the meaningful, or the significant possesses a creative power appears in various cultures and traditions of thought. For a long time it was dismissed as metaphysical, yet modern cosmology has surprisingly reignited this question. For one of the greatest mysteries of physics is the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. The natural constants that determine our universe are set with a precision that is almost unfathomable. If they were to deviate even minimally, there would be no stable atoms, no stars, no chemistry, no life, and no consciousness. The probability of a life-friendly universe appears vanishingly small, trillions to one. Fascinant to circumvent this problem, the idea of a multiverse has been proposed. Countless universes with random properties, of which we happen to inhabit one that allows for life. Yet this explanation merely shifts the riddle. It does not explain why there should be a multiverse at all, or why its laws are such that universes can even arise. Above all, it does not clarify why value emerges in the first place. For even if there were countless universes, the question remains, why does one exist in which meaning is possible? Here, another interpretation comes into play. Perhaps the fine-tuning is not a coincidence but a hint. Perhaps the universe is not primarily oriented towards structure, but towards value intensity, towards the possibility of experience, meaning, and significance. Value intensity does not refer to moral evaluation in the narrow sense. It refers to the ability of reality to generate meaning, joy and suffering, beauty and knowledge, relationship and experience. A universe that contains these possibilities is not neutral. It is rich in inner quality. If existence itself is oriented towards value, then consciousness is not merely a byproduct of chance. It is the bearer of these values, the place where reality experiences itself as significant. In this perspective, consciousness is not just an observer of the world, but the locus where existence is justified. Not in a moral sense, but in an ontological one. Something exists because it can carry meaning, and meaning exists only in consciousness. This leads to a provocative question. Could it be that the universe exists to enable meaning? If one takes this thought seriously, our image of reality fundamentally shifts. Then existence is not a blind process, but an event oriented towards experience, not planned in the human sense, but structurally open to value. In this view, the problem of infinite regress is also alleviated. If existence arises from meaning, it does not require an external cause. Meaning is self-sustaining. It does not justify itself through something else, but through its own intensity. An experience does not need to be explained to be real. It is real because it is experienced. Similarly, existence could be real because it carries meaning, not because it was caused. This idea has been revisited in modern philosophy. The notion that value plays a fundamental role seems less far-fetched today than it did just a few decades ago, not least because the materialistic worldview has reached its explanatory limits. It describes how things happen, but not why meaning exists at all. If we are honest, meaning is the only thing that truly matters to us. Everything we do, everything we explore, everything we evaluate occurs against the backdrop of significance. Without it, every insight would be empty, every truth meaningless. Perhaps that is the crucial hint. That meaning is not a random byproduct, but the center of reality. In this light, the existence of conscious beings takes on a new context. We are not merely spectators in an indifferent universe. We are bearers of meaning, places where reality experiences itself, nodes where value emerges. This does not mean that humanity is the center of the universe. It means something deeper. That consciousness, wherever it exists, plays a fundamental role. That existence without meaning would be incomplete. Perhaps that is the reason why the universe exists at all. Not to move matter, but to enable experience. Not to create structures, but to bring forth meaning. In the end, there remains a question that cannot be definitively answered, yet it transforms everything we think about existence. Does something exist because it carries meaning, or does it carry meaning because it exists? Perhaps the truth is more radical than either alternative. Perhaps existence and meaning are two sides of the same reality. Without consciousness, nothing would have meaning. But what if nothing would exist without consciousness either? Perhaps the universe is not cold and random. Perhaps it is profoundly inward, and perhaps consciousness did not arise in the universe, but the universe exists within consciousness. If that is the case, everything changes. Not only our image of reality, but also our understanding of ourselves. Then you are not a random observer in a blind cosmos. You are a place where existence takes on meaning, a point where reality experiences itself. If that is so, only one question remains, one that no theory can answer for you. What does this perspective on existence mean for you? For your life, your choices, your responsibility? Spirit to Spirit, your Zeitgeist.